Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you today? May you always be healthy and full of blessings. Before starting, let's start by reciting a prayer. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. May this prayer be a way for us to get intercession from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the Day of Judgment. Ameen. Hello Muslim friends, meet again with the Islamic Lantern channel. Before we continue, it would be nice if we support this channel by clicking the subscribe, like, comment, and share buttons. Dawn was still covering the sky of Paris when Maria stared at her reflection in the old mirror in her simple room. Her eyes scanned every detail of her face, making sure of the expression she would show in front of people later. Those sharp eyes held something that should not have been there. The place where she grew up, where she devoted herself as a nun for more than 10 years. But today she left everything, not because her beliefs had changed, but because of the mission she had to carry out. That morning, she left her small house wearing clothes far from religious. There were no church attributes. There were no signs of a nun. A hijab covered her hair, trying to appear like someone searching for the truth. A small mosque in the center of Paris was her destination. Her steps were measured, her expression full of fake confusion. When she arrived, the atmosphere was still quiet. Some of the congregation sat in dhikr after the dawn prayer, while others chatted softly on the mosque's terrace. As she walked in, sweeping glances into the prayer room, she saw an old man with a beard sitting against a pillar of the mosque. His face was calm, his eyes soft. This was someone who seemed wise. Maria approached him hesitantly. The old man, noticing her confusion, raised his face and smiled. "Walaikum assalam, young lady. Can I help you?" Maria lowered her head, playing with the edge of her veil. "I still don't know much. I want to learn more about Islam." The old man's eyes sparkled. He patted Maria's shoulder with warmth. "MashaAllah, anyone who seeks the truth will always be welcomed with open arms here." Maria smiled faintly. In her heart, she laughed. How easy it is for them to believe. That day marked the beginning of Maria's deeper infiltration into the Muslim community. She attended study groups, joined congregational prayers, and pretended to ask about Islamic teachings with full sincerity. The congregation began to recognize her as a sincere convert. Every night she returned to her apartment and wrote secret notes. She reread every verse and hadith she had studied, not to understand, but to find weaknesses. In the dark corner of her room, only the light from the laptop screen illuminated her face. Maria leaned back in her chair, smiling thinly. She muttered to herself, "Just wait, it's only a matter of time." Week after week passed, and she infiltrated deeper. The Muslim community in Paris was growing more and more. She came to the mosque every day, attending studies and participating in religious discussions. Every time she spoke, she always showed great curiosity, as if she truly wanted to understand the teachings of Islam. "Salma, you are truly extraordinary. In just a short time, you have understood many things," said a woman wearing a hijab who was sitting beside her after the study was over. Maria, who now used the name Salma, just smiled. "I am still learning," she answered modestly, but in her heart she was laughing. How easy it is. They accept strangers into their circle. They believe so easily without hesitation, without suspecting that her intention was not at all to seek the truth. Every night, Maria wrote down everything she learned. She recorded her views on Tawheed, the oneness of Allah, and the Islamic creed. All of it was documented in a secret forum. That night, another message appeared on the forum. "The time is coming again. You must go further. Make sure you are fully trusted before moving to the next stage." The next day, Maria returned to the mosque as usual. This time, a ustaz who had just returned from a missionary trip to the Middle East was the speaker. After the study was finished, Maria approached him. "Ustaz, I want to ask something." "Of course, Salma. What do you want to ask?" Maria displayed an expression full of confusion. How can someone be truly sure that Islam is the right path? How do we know that we are not being deceived by our own beliefs? The ustaz smiled wisely. "Guidance comes from Allah. If our hearts are open, the truth will be felt by itself." Maria nodded slowly, pretending to contemplate the answer, but in reality she dismissed it. As a convert full of enthusiasm for learning Islam, she attended every study, sitting in the front row, taking notes attentively, and often asking deep questions that seemed like a genuine search for knowledge. The congregation loved her. Many considered her a lucky new sister who had received guidance. Some felt called to guide her further. Until one day, something unexpected happened. You are on an extraordinary spiritual journey. We know you are still in the learning stage, and Umrah will be a profound experience to strengthen your faith. Some other pilgrims who heard the conversation immediately responded with excitement. Subhanallah! This is a great opportunity for you, Salma. You will feel extraordinary blessings in the Holy Land. Maria lowered her head, trying to hide her smile. In the secret form she usually used, she typed, "I will go to Mecca soon." A response appeared shortly after. "Good. Do what you have to do there." Maria closed her laptop, her eyes shining with excitement. "I will prove that there is nothing sacred there," she muttered softly. The following days were filled with preparation. She learned how to do ihram, how to recite the intention of Umrah, how to perform tawaf and sa'i. She studied everything carefully, making sure no one suspected her. A few days before departure, someone handed her ihram clothes. "This is from one of our sisters. She wants you to wear this during Umrah later." Maria accepted the white cloth with both hands, then smiled meaningfully. In a moment, she just had to be patient, waiting for the day of departure. The day of ascension finally arrived. The atmosphere was filled with joy as they prepared to visit the Baytullah. Maria just smiled thinly. In her heart, she laughed at how easily they were carried away by their beliefs. After dozens of hours on the plane, the group finally arrived at their destination. As soon as they set foot in the airport, the atmosphere changed. The air felt warmer, and in the distance, several other pilgrims from various corners of the world could be seen. Maria followed the group to Mecca on the bus. Next to her, a young pilgrim named Salma sat. "I didn't think we could make this journey. What do you feel now?" Salma asked, full of enthusiasm. Maria smiled slightly. "I can't express it in words." As they approached the holy city, Maria observed the sea of people moving in unison. In the distance, the sound of the call to prayer from the Grand Mosque echoed among the tall buildings. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Just be patient a little longer." The next morning, she joined the group at the Grand Mosque to perform their first tawaf. Her steps slowly followed the flow of thousands of people moving around the Kaaba. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the surge of emotions inside her. In the crowd, the Hajar Aswad came into view. She followed the thousands of pilgrims moving slowly. Each step felt heavy, not from fatigue, but from something bigger that was unfolding around her. The congregation appeared solemn. They prayed, cried, and reached out to touch the sacred stone with deep reverence. Maria noticed an old man with tears streaming down his cheeks as his lips kissed the black stone. She frowned. "How foolish they are," she thought to herself. Beside her, Salma reached out. "Let's get closer. God willing, we will touch the Hajar Aswad." Maria smiled slightly and nodded. She let herself be carried by the crowd, holding on as the words of faith and devotion surrounded her Aswad. The light of the lamps of the Grand Mosque reflected the sparkle on the black stone, making it look so dazzling in the midst of thousands of hands trying to reach it. Her heart was beating fast. This was the time. Her right hand slowly lifted, pretending to want to touch the holy stone. But in her left hand, the paper was ready to be left. But the paper was cold. Something strange happened. An extraordinary hot sensation suddenly hit her face. The heat was not like the air of Mecca that burned the skin, but like hot coals that penetrated her flesh directly. Maria's eyes widened. Her mouth, which was originally about to spit on the black stone, instead opened wide in a stifled scream. Her hands were shaking. Her legs suddenly felt weak. Her body staggered, and she tried to pull away, but couldn't. She tried to turn around, but her body felt like it was being held by something invisible. Maria wanted to scream, but the sound that came out of her throat was just a groan of pain. The people around her started to turn around. A middle-aged woman who was standing not far from her stepped back, her face pale. "Astaghfirullah," she whispered, seeing Maria suddenly lose her balance. Maria felt a burning sensation that was getting worse. The pain was unbearable. She fell face down on the white marble floor of the Grand Mosque, and beside her, the paper, the insult, fell out of her grasp. Maria lay face down on the floor, white among the sea of people who were beating her, the angry floor, as if something was burning from inside her. The hot air of Mecca seemed to disappear, replaced by a burning sensation that she could not explain. "What is happening?" whispered a congregation member standing not far from her. Several people began to step back, afraid to approach. They saw Maria writhing on the floor, her face pale, then turned black in a matter of seconds. Maria screamed, wanting to ask for help, but the sound that came out of her throat was only a weak groan. Her lips felt dry. Her chest was tight. She tried to raise her hand, but the skin on her arm felt like it was blistering. The heat that crept throughout her body was unbearable. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw something, a faint black figure in the middle of the crowd. A human? No. Without a face, without a sound. The shadows were moving closer. "Number." "This is impossible," Maria whispered, but her voice was drowned out by the hustle and bustle of people who were starting to panic at her condition. A person in Aram approached, trying to ask, "Sister, are you okay?" Maria wanted to answer, but all that came out of her mouth was a strange hiss, like the sound of someone being strangled. Beside her, a veiled woman looked at the paper that had fallen from Maria's grasp. The woman, she squinted and read it for a moment. Her face rested, her eyes widened in misery. "Astaghfirullah," she muttered, shaking. Then she went to utter, "Ah, to Allah, oh my God." She was squinting at something in the middle of sucking all her life from within. Her screams finally broke. "Help!" The voice echoed around the Grand Mosque. Some people who were around the Hajar Aswad were now getting further away from her. Security officers began to arrive. One of the officers tried to help her stand up, but as soon as his hand touched Mary's arm, she was pulled back, shocked. "Oh my God!" the officer whispered, his lips trembling. His mouth tried to form words, but only a hoarse sound escaped. At that moment, she began to see something more terrible. The black shadows were getting closer. They stood in a circle around her, without a face, without a sound. Maria tried to close her eyes, hoping all this was just a hallucination. But when she opened them again, the shadows were now closer, clearer, and staring at her. Maria screamed in fear, but no one could help her now. She was still lying on the white marble floor of the Grand Mosque, her body writhing as if something was burning inside her. The people who saw it did not dare to approach. Some could only stare in horror, while others whispered, "Diarrhea." They ... One of the security officers finally called out, "Take her out of this area," he said firmly. Two other officers immediately lifted Maria's body, which was now limp. But as soon as Mary's hand touched her, he knelt down in shock. "Astaghfirullah," the officer whispered. His hand was numb. His tongue felt thick. His body began to feel numb, but the heat did not decrease at all. "Lift her onto a stretcher," came the instruction of another officer. Soon a stretcher was brought to the scene. Maria was lifted carefully and taken out of the Hajar Aswad area to the medical room in the Grand Mosque. Along the way, her body continued to tremble. Her vision blurred, but she could still see the black shadow following her in the distance. Maria shut her eyes tightly, praying for it to disappear. But when she opened them again, the shadows were even closer. Upon arriving at the medical room, the doctor on duty immediately conducted an examination. "She is in severe shock," said one of the nurses. Maria lay on the medical bed. Her face was darkening. Her hands clawed at the air as if fighting something invisible. One of the doctors took a thermometer and tried to measure her body temperature. A few seconds later, the screen showed 39 degrees Celsius, then 42, 45, until suddenly the screen went dead. The doctor was stunned. "What happened?" A nurse tried to wipe her sweat. A strange, raspy sound escaped Maria's lips. Her eyes were vacant. In the corner of the room, a medical officer found a piece of crumpled paper that Maria had brought. He picked it up and started reading it. The next second, his eyes widened in horror. What was this? The doctor standing next to him turned around. What was wrong? The officer handed him the paper. The doctor read the contents of the writing on it, and his face immediately turned tense. The paper contained insults against Islam, against the Kaaba, against Allah. The doctor held the paper tightly and then looked at Mar, who was in pain on the bed. Oh God, he dared to desecrate this holy place. His eyes were now filled with sticky rice, tall figures, faceless. Only darkness moved and floated around him. One of them approached. Mar wanted to scream, but no sound came out of her mouth. Then something happened. The black figure raised his hand and grabbed it. Maria felt her body burning. Her sister, who was originally cold, was biting. She was no longer in the room. She was somewhere else, a place filled with darkness. Maria tried to run, but her body couldn't move. The shadows now surrounded her completely. She tried to pray, but there was nothing she could say. Her tongue felt numb. She wanted to cry, but no tears came out. And at that moment, she realized she had fallen into something she couldn't avoid, something more terrible than death. Mar was lying on the medical bed of the Grand Mosque. Her body was shaking, sweat was pouring down her face. But that wasn't what made the doctors and nurses stunned. Her skin was turning black. The doctor holding the thermometer shook his head, seeing the numbers on the screen rising drastically before the device just turned off. Mar tried to lift her hand. Her fingers were shaking, her nails were clawing at empty air. But when she saw her own hand, she gasped for breath. Her fingers were starting to turn black. Her bones. "Help me!" Maria's voice was hoarse, almost inaudible. Around her, the doctors and nurses started to panic. They tried various ways to calm her down, but nothing worked. "There are no burns on her body, but her skin is peeling like it has been exposed to fire," said a doctor with a trembling voice. Mar felt younger. This time, it was normal. This time, sir, the heat was not only in her body, she felt something more. The heat was terrible, as if it came from within her soul. She closed her eyes, hoping it would all go away. But when she opened them again, the black figures got closer. They didn't speak. They didn't move in a way that humans could explain. They just existed, and they stared at her. Maria tried to move, but her body felt stiff. She wanted to scream, but her voice was stuck in her throat. "What did you ask?" the doctor asked. "What happened to her?" Mar wanted to answer, wanting to admit that it was something she couldn't explain. Her face, something was gripping her throat. Blood came out of her mouth. The doctors and nurses stepped back. "Oh my God," whispered one of them. Maria felt the world around her start to spin. She could no longer hear human voices. All she could hear now were whispers, whispers from something invisible, whispers that echoed in her ears. Maria closed her eyes. She wanted to fight. She wanted to go back. But it was too late. The black shadow was now standing right beside her, and they were waiting. Maria was lying on the medical bed, her body writhing as if something was crawling on her. Her body temperature continued to rise. But what was more terrifying was the redness of her skin, which was getting blacker and peeling like charcoal. Around her, no medical explanation could describe what was happening to this woman. Meanwhile, in the corner of the room, a medical officer was still holding the paper found near Maria's body. The paper was full of insulting writings against Islam, the Kaaba, and Allah. "What should we do?" whispered a nurse with a pale face. The doctor standing beside her shook his head weakly. "This is not something that can be explained medically." Maria opened her eyes with difficulty. The world around her seemed blurry. The faces of the doctors and nurses began to disappear, replaced by the darkness that enveloped the room. She tried to lift her hand, but she no longer felt her own body. The incredible burning sensation was still there, but what was more terrible was the feeling of her very soul being sucked into something invisible. And at that moment, she saw them again, the black shadows. They were now closer. Maria wanted to scream, wanted to refuse, wanted to run away, but her body could no longer move. One of the black figures floated towards her. Maria could feel its presence, so real, The air around her became heavy, pressing against her chest. Her lips trembled, but the sound that came out was only a soft hiss. The figures did not leave. They got closer. Maria could see the thick darkness that enveloped them. There were no faces, no eyes, but she knew they were staring at her. Then one of them raised a hand that resembled black mist and touched Maria's forehead. At that moment, her body convulsed. The doctor and nurse in the room watched in horror as Maria's body arched unnaturally. She seemed to be fighting against something unseen. The entire room trembled. The scream that tore through the air was not just the scream of an ordinary human. It was the scream of someone being dragged into the darkness. The nurses stepped back, their faces frozen with fear. They wanted to help, but something deep inside them told them there was nothing they could do. Maria's screams grew weaker, and then she began to mutter something, a sound that did not belong to this world. The world around her changed. She was no longer in the medical room of the Grand Mosque. She was in another place, a dark place, a place with no walls, no boundaries. And in that place, she was alone. Or was she? She felt something. She was not alone. In the distance, something was waiting, and that something began to move. The air around her thickened. Whispers echoed in her ears, distant, unintelligible. Something was appearing from within the darkness. The shadows were no longer just silhouettes. They had shape. They had presence. Maria held her breath. The figures had no faces, but they seemed to see her. They stood around her silently, without movement. Then one of them stepped closer. Maria wanted to run, but her body could not move. The figure got closer, so close that Maria could feel something strange, not hot, not cold, but something worse than that, a fear that pierced her bones. Then the figure raised his hand, holding the black cab. And there was Maria. It was far away. She was in the medical room of the Grand Mosque. Maria's body was convulsing violently. The doctors and nurses stared at her in horror. "What happened to her?" shouted a doctor. Maria clawed at the air. Her eyes widened without focus. She screamed, but the scream sounded choked, as if something was blocking her throat. The security guard entered the room. One of them grabbed Maria's bag that was lying on the floor. He opened it carefully and found something that immediately made him shudder in horror. Inside the bag were several sheets of paper containing the same writing as that found near the Hajar Aswad. Insults against Islam, against the Kaaba, against Allah. The officer looked at the doctor beside him. "She came here not to worship," he said softly. The doctor gritted his teeth, then looked at Maria, who was now getting weaker on the bed. Meanwhile, Maria's body was losing its color. Her skin was blackening, getting darker, as if something was sucking all the life out of her. In her mind, Maria was still trapped in the darkness. The shadows were now getting closer. They were no longer standing still. They were moving toward her. And Maria finally realized something. She had fallen into something she could not escape. There was no way out, no more lies that could save her. And when the shadow finally reached her, she felt something more terrifying than anything she had ever experienced. Something worse than death. Maria wanted to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. And then the darkness swallowed her. In the medical room of the Grand Mosque, Maria's body finally collapsed weakly. Her heart stopped beating, open but empty. In the corner of the room, a nurse whispered in a trembling voice, "Oh my God, finally!" Something burned. No one was there, and near the black stone, the insulting paper she had written still lay on the white marble floor, a silent witness to the evil intentions that had finally consumed her. The atmosphere in the medical room of the Grand Mosque feels so tense. The doctors and nurses who have been trying to save Maria can now only stand still, staring at her body that is no longer moving. Her eyes are still open but empty. Her skin, which was originally red, is now completely black like burnt charcoal. Even part of her body looks like it is peeling, leaving dried flesh. One of the doctors approached carefully, trying to touch her wrist to find a pulse. But as soon as the doctor's finger touched her skin, she immediately pulled her hand back. "Astagfirullah," she whispered. Maybe this is a reply from Allah. The doctor who heard those words turned his head. What do you mean? The security officer, who was still holding the paper found in Maria's bag, showed the writing to the doctor. This is proof that she came here not to worship, but to do something evil. The doctor read the writing on the paper with a serious face. His forehead wrinkled and the look in his eyes changed. Astaghfirullah, he whispered. Almost. Had she not. But in the end, justice prevailed. The evil she planned ultimately destroyed her instead. This is the end of our video. If you enjoy Islamic content like this, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.